Good morning and welcome back to my channel. Today is my Black Writers wrap up. Incidentally, all of these books are nonfiction and in the same color scheme, which was unintentional. If I had an eye for branding, I would have worn an orange shirt. But I would like to start with Maya Angelou's Gather Together in My Name. Now this book is actually the sequel to her award-winning national bestseller, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which I have read twice, and it took me reading twice to realize it was actually part of a series of autobiographical works. Now you can read this without reading that first book. However, I feel like I got so much more out of Maya's journey and experience by knowing where she came from, how she was raised, how she viewed the world, not just in terms of race, but also gender and power. And in this story, just from the years of like 16 to 19 or 16 to 20, she lives quite the life. Just in terms of work, in that time period, Maya was a cocktail waitress, a pimp, a fry cook, a prostitute, almost in the military, also managed to be a professional dancer with a very, very interesting audition story that made me want to laugh and cry. She does so much in these years as a young woman coming into her own, bouncing around the country, living with different members of her family, trying to provide for her infant son and figure out what kind of woman she wants to be. I mean, something that I find so inspirational about her in this story, but also in general, is that even at that age, at 17, 18, 19, she knew she was smart. She knew she was talented. She knew that she was clever and really, what's the word I'm looking for? Not crafty, that makes it sound manipulative, but resourceful, definitely resourceful. And I found myself laughing out loud at so many places in which she was the epitome of fake it till you make it, because homegirl needed a job. She needed to figure out where she was getting money from next, and she made it work. I also empathize with her stories of romance and love. Although she was in situations that I myself have never been in, I understand feeling like what you want is only possible in the pages of a book or up on the big screen, and trying to find a partner who is everything she wants him to be, but also someone who has his own dreams and his own goals and will be a good surrogate / adoptive father to her son. In this story, I say story, but it's her life. Like in this book, looking at Maya through these years, although we are both young Black women in America, her being in the 1940s, dealing with a level of Jim Crow segregation and racism that I've never experienced, dealing with being a young mother and dealing with economic insecurity, even across all of those barriers, those ways that we are different, I just found myself so enthralled by her story and so invested in how she was going to make do next. What was she going to do next? And there also were moments, because I am in my late 20s and Maya at this time was a teenager, where I was like, girl, no, those are not your friends. Do not trust them. Or, oh no, that man is no good. I can tell the way you're talking about him. I don't believe it. And of course, when you're reading a book, no matter how much you might want to scream at a page, you cannot change the outcome of it, especially when it's someone's life. And based on what I know about Maya Angelou, she is someone who took everything in stride and found a way to not have the silver lining, but to become more strong, to become more clever, to become more intelligent based on what she has learned from the situations she was put in before. So I can't imagine she was a type of woman who, as she was writing this book, was like, oh gosh, I wish I had made all these different choices. But it still was really interesting to have those moments where I felt completely in kinship with her at that age, and moments where I felt so much older than her and thinking like, no, listen to your mother. Like it's a really, really great story. And what makes it even more great is the fact that I am learning more about someone that I admire, whose work I admire. And I'm learning more about how she got to where she was and how all of these situations helped develop her into the person that she eventually became. So Gather Together in My Name, Maya Angelou, would highly recommend it. Again, I would read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, so it's such a good book despite having really heavy content, but you do not need that in order to read this. So if you want to start with something perhaps a little less intimidating, Gather Together in My Name. Next on the list, we have The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And this is something that had been on my TBR for a while. Like I had this book in the house already. And then I serendipitously got hired for an anti-racist book club in which this was the first book. So I was very excited to have a structured time to read it. This book was published in 1963 and is comprised of 2 essays. The first essay is entitled My Dungeon Shook, and the second essay is entitled Down at the Cross. And the title of the book, The Fire Next Time, comes from a line from an old spiritual which is a reference to the Old Testament story of Noah, the ark, and the flood. And the line goes, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. And as I said, this book was published in 1963, which made it the 100th year, the centennial, I believe it's called, anniversary of emancipation. But as Baldwin says in these pages, America was celebrating the freedom of the Negro 100 years too soon. This book, again, another book that is short, powerful in every sense of the word. I actually read it twice. Like, I read the whole thing, did the work I had to do for the book club, and then read it again, because this is one of those texts that every single page could be annotated, This is one of those books that every single page could be annotated, geez, and every single line could be highlighted, and it just gives you so much to chew on. In the first essay, which is the shorter one, Baldwin is actually addressing his nephew, who's about 15 years old. And the first word that comes to my mind is heartbreaking, because Baldwin is a man who has watched his grandfather, his father, his brother, and himself, and now his nephew, grow up in a country that is actively trying to destroy him, that is trying to make Black people satisfied with mediocrity, that bears them into these circumstances that are beyond their control, that are not of their making, and forces them to deal with a quality of life solely because they are Black and for no other purpose. And what's so challenging to me about this text that overall has an air of hope, an air of victory about it to me, the way he talks to his nephew and reminds him that great things have happened in this country and great things that can happen again. The way he tells his nephew that you are an American, you have every right to the promises and glory that this land can offer. Do not let yourself be driven from these shores. Do not believe what white people say about you, because as James Baldwin says, his own grandfather was defeated long before his death, because deep down, he truly believed what white people said about him. And it sounds so simple when you put it in those words, but even as James Baldwin, a Black man living in 1963, was speaking this, now, a Black woman in 2021, I understand how hard it is to not let what the white world says about you infiltrate your mind, infiltrate your heart, and infiltrate your spirit, because you're constantly getting these messages, explicit and implicit, about your worth, about your intelligence, your character, your ability, your history or your lack of history, especially if you were educated in a school system like I was, where Black history was just Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and slavery. Like, it hurts, but it's also powerful, the fact that so much of what Baldwin is saying in this essay to his nephew resonates with me now as a Black woman in 2021. And what I think is especially powerful about this essay is Baldwin explores an idea that he explores later on in the book as well, that he was actually ridiculed at the time for, and I'm sure some people would ridicule him now for it, but he argued against separatism. He argued against hating white people for what they've done. He says that he often has to pity white people for what they've done, because if he didn't pity, he would hate them, and the hate would destroy himself. He believes that the freedom of the Black community is intrinsically tied with the freedom of the white community. And what was considered the Negro problem in 1963 actually isn't a problem between Negroes whatsoever. It is a problem between white people and each other. The fact that they had to create a system in which they are positioned at the top of the universe and everyone else is at the bottom speaks to something within themselves that they need to figure out. And it's so hard for me to not speak of these ideas of forgiveness and love with a little bit of like tension, because he's not speaking about forgiveness and love in a very like pat, simplified, romantic, fluffy way. He is talking about a cosmic sense of justice and love, a love that challenges you and changes you, a love that forces you to see who you really are. He has this brilliant line that I'm going to misquote in a second about how love forces you to remove your mask, but also forces you to realize that you are reliant on that mask to survive. It's such a powerful sentiment, and I'm going to try to pick another adjective, but it's the most appropriate one I can think of. And in the second essay, Down at the Cross, this is where I was like really getting taken to church, because he is spending the majority of this essay critiquing the church and exploring the rhetoric and his experience with the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, because Baldwin was actually, which I never knew this, a teen preacher. And it wasn't until he he got older, started moving away from the church, started to explore more cultures and religions, he had a Jewish best friend who asked him some really simple, honest questions that he struggled to answer with the rhetoric he was given from the institution of the church. And over time in this essay, he's talking about the pros and the cons of the way Christianity is used to in many ways sanctify, in many ways support colonization, but also the strength that many in the African American community find from their home church, from these ideas of salvation and justice and a better life once their life on earth is done. He also gives a perspective on the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad that I have never heard before, even though I have studied Elijah Muhammad and W.D. Fard and Malcolm X and Clara Muhammad, even though I've learned a lot more about the Nation of Islam in my upper level graduate religion courses. It's very interesting to have someone who isn't coming from a background of I'm here to study the religion or the faith tradition, talk about going to Elijah Muhammad's house and seeing how the people in his circle interacted with him, and seeing how Elijah interacted with the fact and dealt with the fact that James Baldwin was someone who had friends, close friends, who were white, when at this time the Nation of Islam rhetoric was that all white people were devils. It is so fascinating to watch this clearly intelligent man, empathetic man who has deep personal experience in the Christian church, but also has some more surface level, more introductory experience with Nation of Islam, talk about the different ways the rhetoric of those religions are providing comfort and support and strength and guidance to a Black community, but also, in his opinion, holding them back in many ways. There is so much to unpack here in this short little text. The intersections of religion and race are so deep and nuanced, and I'm talking about the religion part of this second essay because it comprises the majority of it, but he also talks about history. He also talks about the perceptions that people have about their place in the universe. He's also talking about his very personal experiences growing up in Harlem, growing up in poverty, the discrimination and racism he's faced at the hands of police officers and doormen and then bartenders and shopkeepers. Like, it's a mix of his personal stories, his personal anecdotes, and how they connect to this larger system of oppression and systemic racism that also ties into his overall views around, as I said, justice and love and forgiveness. This is one of my favorite nonfiction books I have ever read. It is so fascinating. It is so well written. It is so excellent. And I could honestly put 15,000 quotes on the screen as I'm talking about this that I just want to have like etched into my skin, framed up on my wall. They were that impactful to me. The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin. And finally, we have Witnessing and Testifying, Black Women, Religion, and Civil Rights by Rosetta E. Ross. Cool thing about Dr. Ross, she actually lives in Atlanta, so maybe one day I'll run into her. But this is actually a book that I was assigned for school, and though I have not spoken about any of my graduate school readings yet, I wanted to talk about this one because reading The Fire Next Time on the heels of this book gave me just so much more perspective around not just the civil rights movement, but the role of religion and women within it. So in this book, it goes through the stories of Clara Muhammad, Clara Muhammad, I'm not exactly sure how she pronounced it, who was the wife of Elijah Muhammad, First Lady of the Nation of Islam, and responsible for an incredible amount of work in that organization. It also talks about Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a grassroots leader in the South trying to mobilize people on their rights to vote. It also talks about Diane Nash, who was a middle/upper class student who was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who was basically the main reason that the Freedom Rides continued to go on. Her and John Lewis were there after they had been stopped after that brutal mob. I mean, it goes through multiple women that I guarantee most of us have never heard of as who were part of the civil rights movement, who were behind the scenes doing incredible grassroots work, doing administrative work, whose positions were being challenged by members in the civil rights movement who did not want to listen to women, despite how impactful they were on a political level, on a student level, on a grassroots level. They were teachers, they were organizers, they were protesters, they were people who volunteered to spend months in jail. These were women who got shit done, who made a huge impact on the civil rights movement, and for the most part are ignored by civil rights history in favor of talking about people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis and Abernathy, and men who did great things, men who were leaders, but men who could not have done what they had done without the work of these women. Many of these women who are unnamed in our museums and unnamed in our books and unnamed in our 5th grade presentations about the civil rights movement. Some of these women I was familiar with before I read this book. Specifically, Fannie Lou Hamer is an icon of mine, and I was familiar with Diane Nash on a surface level, but so many other women who really spoke about how their challenge of fighting for racial equality while also dealing with sexism and misogyny within their own spaces and within their own organizations constantly had to be managed throughout their lives. And what I really appreciated about Dr. Ross in this book is that, yes, she included many women who identified as Christian, but she also included, as I said, Clara Muhammad, who was a Muslim woman, because I think as well in our American context, we often like to ignore the role that the Nation of Islam, the role that Black Muslims, the role that Elijah Muhammad and W.D. Fard and all of these people played on the civil rights movement, especially considering that, I mean, Martin Luther King also had an FBI file on him, as did Malcolm X, as did James Baldwin, but especially considering so many of the assassinations that our federal government and our police forces were involved with when it came to Black leaders. I just really appreciated that she made a point to not say that the civil rights movement was solely fueled by Christianity, even though many, many prominent people were Christian or came from Christian backgrounds. Another thing I loved about this book is that Dr. Ross made a point to include childhood information and information about each of these women's parents, because in many of the cases, the way that these women thought about justice, thought about their role as human beings in terms of a global community, the way they thought about their responsibility to their fellow man was informed by their parents, was informed by their grandparents and the way they grew up. And it was so fascinating to learn not only about these women, but especially these women's mothers, who were subversive, who were in many ways defenders of their families, the women who would do subtle things like creating an environment in their home where people who were travelers and people who were escaping slavery and people who were escaping violence would have a place to hide. People who did much more, I'll say, outward aggressive things, like telling a white man that if he tried to beat her children, she would shoot him dead. And I just appreciated how Dr. Ross did not prioritize one over the other. One of my least favorite social justice t-shirt quotes I see online nowadays is, "I'm not my grandparents, you can catch these hands." And I find it so disrespectful, but also incredibly ignorant, because this book will tell you there were women who were in times of Jim Crow, who were sharecroppers, who were disenfranchised, who would choose to beat their own kids in order to prevent a white man from beating them because she knew a white man would kill them. There were also women that said, "If you get off that horse, I will shoot you dead before you can touch my child." And Dr. Ross in no way prioritizes one over the other. We, especially in our time, even though we are still dealing with racism, people who have never experienced slavery, people who have never experienced the Jim Crow South and the Reconstruction era, I think we have absolutely no business critiquing our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our ancestors, and especially the ones of those who were women, who were doubly disenfranchised for how they chose to fight. Whether it looks like submission, but it's actually subversive, whether it's outward defensive, outward aggression that really isn't aggression, it's just a form of love for yourself and your family to not let someone treat you like that. There are so many different ways women chose to fight as individuals, and so many different ways that these women in this book chose to fight as part of the movement. And I just really, really love that this story that specifically focused on Black women was part of one of my courses on women and religion. So, Witnessing and Testifying, Black Women, Religion, and the Civil Rights, by Dr. Rosetta E. Ross, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, and Gather Together in My Name by Maya Angelou. These are 3 nonfiction books by Black writers that I have read in the past month or 2. I loved all of them. I'm so grateful that all of them crossed my paths in their various ways, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.